Welcome to the video. In this particular session I'm going to be looking at the single locomotives, the single driving wheels that were introduced by Triang in the early 60s and carried on right up until the present day with Hornby. So first off here we're looking at Lord of the Isles, which was in fact the very first single model that Triang introduced back in 1961. This is still a particularly good representative because if you're looking for one of these now, you'll tend to find that the dome and the top feed cover are somewhat tarnished, but they're still in reasonably good condition on this model here. I think it's worth pointing out that Triang took quite a risk with introducing something like this, and it was quite a courageous and fortuitous decision that they decided to model a locomotive that dated back to the late 19th century. Because if you're looking back at the history of model railways, both Triang and Hornby at the time were very much trying to reflect the railway as it was then. So any sort of developments that were happening on the network would be reflected in the models and the train sets that both Triang and Hornby were producing at that time. If we're looking, at this one, but 1961, that was also the year in which Triang introduced the EM2 electric locomotive with the pantographs, and that in itself again is quite a stunning model. But this was quite an adventurous step to take by Triang, because both Triang and Hornby were making these models essentially for children. These were very much still a children's toy and a children's sort of hobby activity. So to take the bold step and manufacture something which was dating back to the late 19th century is quite an ambitious undertaking. So this is Lord of the Isles, and you can still see that it's still a very good model. I think a few little small details have been picked out on this. I think the axle boxes and things in sort of like a brass colour, and there's coal in the tender, and there's crew that's been located in the cab and on the tender there. I think you would agree that it's still a good looking model and it's still in good condition. This would have difficulty going round on my layout because of the rather large flanges, particularly on the driving wheel. The pickups on this are on the main driving wheel and on the rear wheel supporting the cab there. So if we move on to the next one, we've got Lord of the Isles as it was reintroduced by Hornby back in the early 2000s. This came from a set which included 3 clerestory coaches. They were the early short ones, which in fact had been introduced with the original model back in 1961. And I think we can see from this that there's a much finer representation of the finish on this locomotive, particularly with the lining and the emblem, the transfers, and again it's got that very characteristic brightly brassed up dome cover and the safety valve cover on the firebox there. And also I think you can see there's some very fine lining around that wheel. And again, you can see on the tender that the printing is a lot finer, and it's a lovely looking locomotive. The higher standard of finish does give this locomotive a lift. And I think you can see also that the front bogie has pickups on it. The wheels are finer, the flanges on these wheels are finer, so there's been some additional upgrading of the chassis on this locomotive, which can make it much more consistent with the more modern track gauges, code 75, code 100. That's pretty standard now. So the next one along is Lorna Doone, and this one has a slightly different finish. Apparently this is a later style of finishing that was introduced by the GWR. So the sort of Indian red, brown, whatever, sort of chassis and frames are just painted plain black here. But I don't know whether you can see, there's a very fine lining out, a red line that goes around the extremities of the bogie and the chassis and the frames. So this gives it a different sort of look. This also was come in the early 2000s. I think it was a limited edition. And a nice touch also is the way that Hornby have finished the smokebox door with that sort of lining, or the picked out nature of the actual door, the securing dart and the hinges. That's beautifully done, and it does give the locomotive a very smart appearance. It's also on the later version of Lord of the Isles there. You can just see it. So there you go, a 3/4 view of Lord of the Isles. And here's Lorna Doone. So moving on to the next one, this one is named Great Western, and this comes from a recent set to commemorate something or other. I can't quite remember what that was about, but it contained two of the later clerestory coaches, which are absolutely superbly finished, and they are really stunning vehicles. Compared to their first introduction in the 1980s. However, I digress, because what we're looking at here is the Dean Single, or Archilles Class as they were properly known, in a further variation here. And this one has got a nicely finished safety valve cover there, like in a lacquered, to give it that brass effect. Compare that to Lorna Doone, and as you can see, that's been painted on. Painted on very well. Looks okay, looks good. But this one is considerably better. So, yes, that one again has got all the nice finishing details. The very fine line, red lining around the bogie frame and the external frame covering the driving wheels. So very fine locomotives. Full marks to Hornby for reintroducing these. They still look splendid. Of course, there's still those sort of old-fashioned characteristics carried over from the Triang days, and it's the gapping, isn't it? The raising up of everything from the rail, which was almost a semi-permanent feature of everything that Triang introduced, but still looks good. So very little bit of information there. I've got a little bit of information about these locomotives. Introduced by William Dean, 1894 to 1899. The Archilles Class. The driving wheel was 7'8" in size. Now, you might be wondering, some of you might be wondering, what was it about these single locomotives, or what was it that possessed designers to make locomotives with big single wheels? Because these weren't the only ones. There's the Midland Railway had the famous Midland Spinners. There was the Stirling Single for the old Great Northern Railway. So the idea and the concept held sway for quite a period of time. The period of time didn't last long, but there was quite a lot of interest in developing the idea. And I think it comes down to a few things, really. It was the easiest way for designers to actually speed up the locomotives and trains, because the very large driving wheel enabled the rotation, gave it a higher speed relative to the accentuation of the valves and the passage of steam in and out of the cylinders. The biggest impediment to steam locomotive speed, and it was something which was grappled with in the 20th century and finally taken to its ultimate in the 1930s, was the ability to admit and exhaust steam from the cylinders. That was one of the biggest impediments to preventing high speed. So you can see that a large wheel with the more languid movements of the motion enabled a relatively higher speed to be obtained with the large wheel. Also, the state of metallurgy, the state of technical design of cylinders and steam passage work, and not to mention lubrication as well, meant that these were things that were in the distance. These were not things which were prevalent at the time, at the end of the 19th century. Of course, the drawback to these engines, which was well understood at the time, was their lack of adhesion. And what you found was that the Midland Railway actually came up with a solution which gave the single locomotive a new lease of life, and that invention was of steam sanding. Previously, sanding of the application of sand to the driving wheels was gravity fed, which was a bit hit and miss. But with a jet of steam, that sand could be directed right to the wheel rim, and it did help with giving these locomotives a bit more life in top link work. So that was the Dean. So these locomotives, they lasted till actually the First World War. They were withdrawn between 1908 and 1915. Moving on, we go to the second incarnation of the Triang Single locomotive. Employing the same chassis, but a new moulding, we have here the Caledonian Single. And it was the only one that was actually built, that is by the railway itself. So a unique locomotive in many senses. Now, what I would say about this is that the exact chassis has been employed as was on the Lord of the Isles, and you can see that there's a new moulding for for the body and a new moulding for the tender. Now, the size of the driving wheel on the real locomotive is only 7 foot, so it's considerably over scale on this model. And this particular one came out in the 1980s under Hornby. It was a reintroduction. I think it'd been introduced. It came in 1963 first of all, fell out of production over various periods of time, reintroduced. This particular one, as I say, was the 1980s, still employing the original chassis with the quite wide flanges on the wheels and no pickups on the bogie. So that's again a nice looking locomotive. Now we come to the reintroduction again in the modern Hornby era, so early 2000s. This one is portrayed, or the single is here portrayed in LMS black with very fine red lining, and I think it looks very good. And moving on, we come to this is a more recent version again. I think this was in a limited edition pack, and here it is in all its Caledonian Railway livery glory. Just look at that, absolutely stunning. Just goes to show again that a superb paint job and a finish job can make a relatively mediocre model look absolutely stunning. Now, I'm not suggesting it's a mediocre model, it's a good model, but it does look a bit dated with all that gapping and that piece that comes down from the boiler to the foot plating there. But look at the detailing of the lining on the wheels, and the very fine lining that goes around the splasher and the sandbox that you can see. It's just up here. That's the sandbox for the driving wheel. Nice emblem, brass emblem on there. Also on the wheel splasher. This also, like I don't know if I mentioned it on this, has the pickups on the bogie wheel as well as the driving wheel and the wheel underneath the cab. Again, the lining, shading is beautifully applied to that tender. Doesn't that make it look really good? So you've got to give full marks to Triang Rovax back in 1961, and with this model in 1963, that they actually, bit the bullet again and produced another single, a unique locomotive. So what I've got here is just I thought I'd put in a representation of one of the coaches that came with this model. There was 3 of these coaches, and again, how beautifully finished they are. Stunning. Quick overview of this locomotive. Built by Nielsen and Company, 1886, as an exhibition locomotive for an international science and technology event in Edinburgh. As I said, the driving wheel was 7 foot. Design was a partnership between the Caledonian Railway's Chief Mechanical Engineer Dougal Drummond and the Nielsen Company. Loco was used in the races to the north in 1888 between Carlisle and Edinburgh. The locomotive was regularly used as a pilot to the Royal Train to and from Balmoral, and for general piloting duties for which it was ideally suited. Ownership passed over to the LMS in 1923, and it saw regular usage hauling an inspection director's saloon over the LMS Scottish system and on services between Perth and Dundee. It was withdrawn in 1935, by which time it was the last single wheeler in service. Now, that speaks volumes for it, doesn't it? It was in service for such a long time. And full marks to the LMS for preserving it and recognising its unique quality. I think it resides at the moment in the Glasgow Transport Museum, but it had a brief sojourn out on the line in the late 50s, early 60s, when it was restored to working order. Anyway, I'll leave it there, folks. I hope you enjoyed this little overview of the single locomotives. These sort of things get neglected, so I thought I'd give them some expose and some prominence, because I think they're very interesting, and I think they're particularly lovely locomotives, and I hope you enjoyed looking at them on the running session that I had out previously. Okay, I'll leave it there now, and thank you for watching.